Hello everyone, greetings from the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, NICE. I'm Ashmita Gautam and I welcome you to the NICE International Women's Summit 2020. NICE International Women's Summit 2020 is organized to bring together the dynamic women experts. By organizing this summit, we hope to create an exclusive space for women. At the time when there is a flood of male panels, or let's say manels, our aim is to reflect the fact that there are enough excellent women experts in the field of international relations, foreign policy, and security issues. As you all know, we have around 71 experts from 12 countries, including Nepal, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, Armenia, the Philippines, Switzerland, Indonesia. There are 10 sessions and that are taking place at the two Zoom rooms simultaneously. And this is the fourth session, as we all already know, and it's going to be moderated by Professor Anuradha Shenoy. Professor Anuradha Shenoy is the former dean at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has been the chairperson of Area Studies Director in the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies. She has also written many books, monographs, and articles in the domain of security issues, development studies, and gender studies. Some of her books include The Maoist and Other Armed Conflicts, Human Security, Concept and Implications, Militarism and Women in South Asia, and the Making of New Russia. Thank you. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you to NICE and Director Pramod Jaiswal. I'm delighted to be here. We have an interesting panel. Each of the panelists will get about 8 to 10 minutes so that we can have some discussion after that. I was looking into the last session and I thought the discussion was very interesting. The first panelist I call upon is Dr. Tamanna Khosla, who is a researcher at WISCOM, and her topic is India, China, and the Ethics of War, Need for Peace and Diplomacy. So, Tamanna, you can start. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So right now I'm at WISCOM and I have done my PhD from JNU CPS under Professor Gurpreet Mahajan. And I was also working with Center for Social Research for quite some time. And so of course I know ma'am pretty well because being from JNU, we know Professor Shenoy so well. So anyways, so the topic which I'm right now dealing is, it's going to be a philosophical discussion. It's India, China and the ethics of war. So I would look at Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now. If the speaker has lost the connection, can we get on to the next speaker and get her back later?
Yes,
so I think I'll call upon Prajita. Prajita, can you hear?
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I can hear you.
Yes, so if you would start, she's going to speak on China's penetration and India's position in South Asia, and we'll get back to Tamanna Khosla a bit later. Yes,
Okay.
so the floor is yours, Prajita.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon to everyone. My topic is China's penetration and India's position in South Asia. So we have to see that there is asymmetry between India and China at one hand, and India and South Asia on the other hand, in terms of military size and economy. Now, why South Asia is important for China? So China's expansionist policy in terms of economy is an important aim in South Asia. And China and South Asia, it is a part and parcel of its global range of economic activities. Then the other thing is South Asian countries, it offers plenty of opportunities and strategic benefits to China. It also, uh, it also provides free cross-border movement of goods, services, natural resources, and abundance of labor. One important aim of China in South Asia is containment of India. As China knows that in the global world and in Asia, if it aspires to become a global power, then it has to contain uh, India, because India is the only country which can challenge China's position in Asia and as well as in South Asia also. So, and another important concern for China is its major concern in the Indian Ocean. And 80% of the China imports of energy are from Indian Ocean. And the political turmoil in South Asia, it offers opportunities for external forces to garner a foothold in the region. Another important thing which brings China to South Asia is the Act East policy of India. So China is trying to divert India's attention from, if China tries to acquire the South Asia uh, space in South Asia, then it will divert the attention of India from East Asia to its own region. So China is trying to do that. So according to John Mayer Schimmer, he is of the view that China, in his work China's Unpeaceful Rise, that if China if China develops economically and it's acquired a global position in economic terms, then it will try to contain all other powers in their own region, in their own region, and his theory proves to be true in South Asia. So there has been rise in China's profile in South Asia to large extent, and Chinese experts have used the term new springtime in China-South Asia relations. They say that South Asia is the most relevant region with regard to rise of China. According to Scott, it is China's new great game to increase its influence in South Asia and restricting India in its own backyard, that is South Asia. China also aspires to become the full member of SARC, and it is already, as we all know, it is already an observer member of the SARC. And this position as an observer member, it was supported by Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal. So these countries supported China's entry into SARC, which was which is a concern for India. So now the question arises that why South Asia is important. If we take in the context of India, we'll see that India shares border with all South Asian countries and is the vital link in the region. 72% of the land surface is occupied by India. 77% of region's population resides in India, and India accounts for 70% of regional economic output. According to famous scholars like S.D. Mooney and C. Rajamohan, they have the view that India, if it aspires to become a global power, it cannot ignore its own region. And similarly, Kadir Grammar, he has used the analogy of wheel to depict the centrality of India, and he says that India is at the hub of the wheel. According to David Malone in his book, Does the Elephant Dance? He says that China's presence in South Asia region challenges the foreign policy of India, and China's deeper integration with South Asian countries economically and strategically, it poses a threat for India as it is encircled by these countries and shares border with the same. Now the question arises, why South Asia is allowing China in its region? So the most important thing is that the South Asian countries, they criticize the role of India as big brother, and they feel that India tries to dominate in their internal affairs, internal matters, and they don't want any interference, much interference, as India tries to play a big brother role and wants to decrease its dependence on India. So it is trying to play China card against India. And South Asian countries have geographical proximity with India, and they fear that India's dominance in terms of its size, economy, and military is which South Asian country does not want. And the other thing is for its own infrastructure development. So China is providing its loan and building railways, ports. So for their infrastructure development, it is helpful South Asian countries. On the other hand, China has China acts makes them feel that it is acting as a neutral player in the region, and it is not trying to interfere in the internal matters of the South Asian countries, which is acceptable for to the South Asian countries. Now, India. China feels that it is the legitimate right of China as a sovereign independent country to have a relation with South Asian countries, and India cannot dictate its relation. But on the other side, India says that India shares border with all the South Asian countries, and it is their right also to protect themselves from any threat which they feel from the external power. So, how China is penetrating? China is having political, economic, and defense ties with South Asian countries through its One Belt and One Road initiative, a string of pearls, and the Maritime Silk Road. It is trying to connect to the South Asian countries. It is building infrastructure, constructing roads, railways, airport, communication lines, and power plants. In this, we have to mention certain ports like China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which connects the Xinjiang province of China to the Gwadar ports of Pakistan. And the port, it has a corridor which passes through the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir region, which India claims. So it raises a concern for India. So without consulting India, China is trying to build the road through it. And in terms of, if you see in terms of trade, then China has become a major trading partner for the South Asian countries. Large number of exports from China goes to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives. We can see that they have trade with India as well, but of late we can see that in case of Bangladesh, China has surpassed India also, and it has become a major export partner of Bangladesh. It is also providing aids and loans to these countries. And other thing what it does is it supplies weapons and technology to these countries, and which are very modern and very advanced. So what now we have to see what are the options for India to contain China. So India should strengthen its relations with the more powerful country like USA, which is more powerful than China in terms of military and economy. And USA also wishes to align with India to counter China. So India should also align with other powerful countries of Asia like Australia, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore to countervail China. And the third thing what India can do is India, like China, should start focusing on China's neighboring countries under the umbrella of Act East policy. So what it will help India, it will help India in diverting China's attention from South Asian region to its own neighboring countries. And another thing what India can do is India should refrain from interfering into the territorial integrity and respect the sovereignty of the smaller countries. See, total interference is not possible, so it should see for a golden mean from interference to the knee jerk, to non-interference to the knee jerk interference. And India should also try to strengthen its military power to the extent of countering China. It should also use multilateral institutions like UNO, UN Security Council, and with the help of USA, and raise its concerns against China at international forum. India at on any cost should prevent China from acquiring full membership of the SARC. Because if China gets the full membership of SARC, it will get much more hold in South Asia and in the regional integration process. And India also should try to strengthen SARC to increase regional integration among the South Asian countries. It provides it a platform where it can, as we know that there are a lot of political conflict among the South Asian countries. So keeping the political thing aside, SARC can play an important role forum where it can align economically in terms of trade. And India should also offer decent projects to neighboring countries that are more attractive compared to China. So to conclude, I would like to say that though China is trying to increase its influence in South Asia to large extent, but India has to take major steps in this direction if it wants to contain China, which and South Asia being an important region for India. And thank you. That's what I want.
Thank you, Aprajita. Thank you especially for keeping your time. Our next speaker is V. Pooja. Are you here, Pooja? I can't see you on the broadcast. Okay,
yes, ma'am, I am here.
Please do start and keep to your about 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I would request them to put on the slides on.
Okay, if you can
yeah, ma'am, I'm
put on the
sharing
slides. In the meantime, you can start. Yeah. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Pooja. I'm postgraduate scholar in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. So the theme of my research is China's counterterrorism strategy. As a case in point, I have taken Xinjiang province. So the research is conducted using deductive method, or also quantitative and qualitative tool. So explain the comprehensive strategy of China, I have started on the objective of the research. So I would like to read out the objective. First is to understand the Chinese threat perception emanating from the terrorism, to observe strategic and ethnic composition of Xinjiang province, to examine the various factors of threat perception emanating from Xinjiang province, to analyze China's counterterrorism strategy, and to assess the prospects and challenges to counterterrorism strategies. The first objective here, I have analyzed 3 factors, which is increasing the threat perception, which is arising from terrorism. One is China's quest for resources. So to satisfy the demands of the domestic population, China is increasing its footprints in the resource-rich land of West Asia and Northern Africa. So these are the regions which is contested by the major jihadist organization, which is actually increasing the threats to China's overseas economic interest. So the second part is, as Aparajita ma'am has already mentioned about the strategic importance of Xinjiang province. So China is actually trying to integrate the Xinjiang province into the Chinese mainland. So it has raised it has instigated the militant groups in the Xinjiang province to act against the policy of the Chinese. And then the third thing is the evolution of the ICT, that is information technology, where it is enabling the protester or the perpetrators to know the loopholes of the loopholes in the government policies as well as infrastructure, which is enabling them to project the war against the country. So next objective is the strategic and ethnic composition. Here I have analyzed what are the strategic as well as ethnic composition of the Xinjiang province. Here we can see in the map that Xinjiang is in the western is located in the western part of the China, and it is a buffer zone between the Chinese mainland and then the various Central Asian countries. Being the economical hub of China, it is providing the linkage to the nations such as South Asia as well as Europe. Xinjiang province is quite critical to the China's Belt and Road Initiative. As well as I even observe the ethnic composition of Xinjiang province. It composes of 56 ethnic minorities, which includes Uyghur, Han, Kazakh, Hui, and Kyrgyz. And in the recent data, I have even observed that the population of the Xinjiang has increased, and that the settlement of the Han Chinese in the Xinjiang province has been increasing considerably. The next is the factors which is leading to the threat perception from the Xinjiang province. So here I have here I have observed and analyzed various threats from the internal sources as well as the external sources. From the internal sources, I have looked into the sinicization of province by the Chinese government through the regulation, what they regulate in the religious activities of the Xinjiang province, as well as the presence of East Turkestan Islamic movement and then Turkestan Islamic movement. They are instigating the population of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province, plus the aids what they are getting from the external support from the organization. And they even Chinese claims that the members of the East Turkestan Islamic movement, I mean, they are part of this Al-Qaeda, and then the members are even sent to various part of the world to participate in the terrorist activities. So these people who come and settle in the Xinjiang province, these instigate the radical ideology in the Xinjiang province, which in turn increases the threat perception which emanates from the Xinjiang province. So next, I have analyzed what are the counterterrorism strategies. So the driving force of China's counterterrorism strategy is mainly due to its vulnerability to the threats, not only from the external sources, but also internal sources. For example, Xinjiang province. So they have utilized various approaches, such as bottom-up approaches, where they use military actions and then just strike hard campaign to curtail the increasing or influence of the militant groups in the province. They are even utilizing the information technologies to surveil and monitor and arrest those people, and to counter the three evils of the society, such as terrorism, separatism, and extremism. And to strengthen the counterterrorism strategy, they have introduced counterterrorism law, wherein China has released its official definition of terrorism, as well as they have even introduced criminal procedure law, where it enables police force to use the tools of technical investigation, such as utilization of biometric data. So thus, we can actually conclude that the Chinese counterterrorism strategy into the 4 C's of counterterrorism, such as crackdown, criminalization, control, and cooperation. Next, I have analyzed the prospects and challenges to the Chinese counterterrorism strategy. The prospects would be that the counterterrorism strategy actually provides a deterrence force against these militant groups, and to establish a peace and security, at least a certain amount of peace and security in the globe, as well as China's counterterrorism strategy is not only limited to its domestic policy, but it is also looking forward to a multilateral engagement and further, multilateral cooperation, such as, multilateral drills between the various countries. The SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation, has a permanent body known as Regional Anti-Terrorism Structure, which focuses on combating these terrorism, three evils of the societies. So here, these are the prospect of the counterterrorism strategy what China is using, and there are multiple challenges to the strategy. One would be China. The main focus of China's counterterrorism strategy is to the emphasis was actually on the domestic terrorism activities which was happening in the Xinjiang region, and there has been another challenges that the cooperation among the state is comparative lower than the other counterterrorism strategy of the different countries. So one of the divergence between the US and China to cooperate in the counterterrorism strategy would be the violation of human rights, which was committed by China through China's counterterrorism strategy. And one more thing is that the China uses counterterrorism strategy on those ethnic population who actually who are dissatisfied with the policies of China. So the research outcome is that the ethnicity actually plays a role, correlates to the domestic rise of terrorism. The suppression of the ethnic group ethnic group forms the militant group, which actually raises the threat perception of the countries. Plus, China's counterterrorism uses the use of technology to checks and balances the terrorism in the Xinjiang province. China aims more on the national security to stabilize the territory, rather than focusing more on the individual liberty and human rights. And despite the prospects challenges, is that the use of forces as a means to combat the terrorism creates an atmosphere of fear and intimidation in the Xinjiang province, which in turn violates the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja, for keeping to your time and being brief. We'll discuss the points later. We now have Bhavna Singh. Bhavna, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear, Bhavna? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
And you can switch off yeah. Bhavna, do start.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to speak on the Simla Agreement and the Ladakh face-off, evolving histories and diplomatic encounters. So before I go on to how the Ladakh reorganization has affected the relations between India and China, I'll just make a brief historical outline of how this entire dispute has shaped over the past few years. The efforts to secure a defined boundary began right after the creation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir in 1846. While in the eastern sector, these efforts have started only almost 65 years later. The Ladakh boundaries were not defined historically until 1683, when the Treaty of Ting Kang. The Treaty of Ting Kang was the first treaty whereby the British and the Indian side somehow tried to define the boundaries in Ladakh. In 1842, again, there was a Ladakh-Tibet war that led to realization for the need of a treaty on boundaries, which led to basically a peace treaty. It wasn't a boundary treaty, but a peace treaty where there was exchange of documents in Tibetan and Persian. So this was the first time there were documents were exchanged. In 1914, the McMahon Line came about by the tripartite agreement, but China never ratified it. So 1914 was basically a lost cause because only the Tibetans, British and the Indian side, only 3 of them consented to sign the 1914 Simla Agreement. But China did not, the Chinese plenipotentiary, who was Chen Yifan, he basically refused to ratify the treaty proposed by Britishers and Tibetans. Similar patterns were repeated, and in 1979, Deng Xiaoping proposed a package solution to Vajpayee. And this package solution is something that has lingered on and on which both the sides have been trying to reach a certain agreement. Recently, the reorganization in J&K has actually basically led to a revival of the boundary question. Till 1947, the Western sector bore the legend of boundary undefined. And during the crisis times of 1962, 1965, and then 1975, the boundary dispute could not be settled militarily because in 1962, the Indians suffered a defeat. In 1965, we somehow tried to get our face back by we defeated the Chinese. But in 1975, again, the military option was made a bit redundant because none of the sides could actually come down to a settlement. So in August 2019, when the Parliament of India passed an act by which Ladakh became a union territory on 31st October 2019, these feelings were rekindled because turning Ladakh into a union territory was an event which unnerved the Chinese somehow. And they believed that the incorporation of Ladakh into the Indian, getting it more under the Indian center's control would somehow deprive them of the advantage they have over the Aksai-Chin and the Daulat Beg Oldi area. So we, over the last few months, since May, especially since May, there have been repeated incursions on in all 3 sectors, starting from Nakula, spelled as Nakula. So there were incursions in Nakula in May 2020. And then just as we had begun the peace talks between the there were the lieutenant general level talks between India and China on 5th June and 6th June. Just as we had begun the talks, there were repeated incursions along the western sector. These could be seen at areas like Galwan, Demchok, Lipu Lake Pass, Hot Springs, and Gogra. So these were certain points where the PLA, which is the People's Liberation Army, made incursions into the Indian side, and they kind of trespassed the limitations that were set on the LAC, the line of actual control. But this was not just the first incident in the recent years. If we remember correctly, in 2013, there were Chinese intrusion in points on pressure points like pressure point 10, 11, 11A, 12, and 13. So this was basically the Chinese tried to blockade access of Indian soldiers to several patrolling points. So this is what has happened again. So if one has to notice, these incursions have become repeatedly frequent. And looking at the current scenario, you could even say that China has used this as an opportunity to divert attention of its domestic audience from the COVID crisis that it has been facing. Most of the internal anger that was that came about against the government was actually diverted to the borders, just so as to control the domestic narrative and domestic discourse about China, how China is projecting its image and how China is doing at the international level. So far, we have managed the implication basically of these incursions along these 5-6 points was that the Chinese have effectively shifted their actual control of the territory almost 18 kilometers to the west, which means it would deny India access to a significant part of territory which is close to the Daulat Beg Oldi airfield, and bring the Chinese much closer to the strategic Darbuk Shok DSDBO road. So if China is effectively able to deter our access to these pressure points, it means that we are on the vulnerability of losing a huge chunk of territory that the Chinese claim along the border. What is exactly happening on the border right now? I would term that as a control war. Why is it a control war strategy? Because neither of the two sides want to go for an all-out war, considering both of them have nuclear pass. Both of them have sufficient nuclear deterrence towards each other. So they do not want to go out for an all-out war, but they are somehow entangled in a control war situation where China continues to push the LAC westwards to secure the Western Highway, which would secure it links between the two regions of Xinjiang and Tibet, while India is trying to push them back into their own territory. As far as India is concerned, we have forced the PLA to pull back almost 2 kilometers from patrolling point 14 and patrolling point 15. So some of these talks have succeeded in attaining the objectives of what you can call disengagement. Denial of access is another aspect of control war. By stalling Indian patrols at bottleneck, Chinese troops are denying India access to basically 5 patrolling points. These are patrolling points 10, 11, 11A, 12, and 13. These patrolling points lie on the arc of almost 20 kilometers from Rakinala to Jeevannala on a line marked as a LOP or a limit of patrolling, which lies a few kilometers to the west of the LAC. So through these talks, there have been 4 rounds of Lieutenant General level talks so far, the latest being at Chushul. It was the entire dispute had erupted because almost 20 Indian soldiers had been killed and around 100 Chinese had been feared injured. along with the loss of a very high-level commander on the side of the Chinese. After these 4 rounds of talk, India has managed to achieve some bit of disengagement as the most immediate step in rescue. But as far as my understanding is concerned, I do not believe that disengagement is a final remedy. And by staying quite on the Depsang Plain is a larger area, which is, it is not the current point of disagreement, because the disagreement is limited to the 5 points in Galwan, Hot Spring and Gogra. But Depsang is a larger area, which the Chinese have somehow managed to almost completely integrate into their own claimed territory. So by staying quite on Depsang Plain, India is actually trying to incentivize China to maintain the status quo ante on the Pangong Tso Lake as of April 2020. But again, to my understanding, staying quiet is not a strategy that would pay India in the long term. There are several lessons that we could learn from what has happened on the border. First is that China's actions have continued to be expansionist in nature. Which if we see the maps from 50 years back, and if we see the maps today, you can see that most of the Depsang Plain area, which comes under the Aksai Chind, it hardly misses out the Daulat Beg Oldi point, and most of the other area has been already annexed by China, with not much opposition from India, to my surprise. Secondly, there has been a wiping away of the no man's land. The no man's land was basically a piece of land where neither of the two sides had controlled for almost several decades. But if you see the maps now, there is no such no man's land that exists. They are increasingly coming to colonize, or rather populate the areas even on which were completely unreachable before. They have started settling small groups of settlements in those areas as well. And China's claims have actually far exceeded their claim of the Karakoram range. So what should be India's strategy? I believe since if you look historically,
you'll have
China
to start concluding.
Had refused to sign. Yes, ma'am, this is my last India strategy, just the last point. So if you look from history, China had refused to sign the Simla Agreement because they had completely, India had recognized Tibet as a neighbor. So my India strategy should be first to propose an inner Tibet and an outer Tibet, as in the case of Mongolia, reflecting from what happened in history. Secondly, strengthening its military force and bracing for war, as most of the criticisms in the media have been about how India does not have the required military reinforcement to act against China. Thirdly, silence is not an option, and rather India should question China's encroachment on Depsang Plains. And fourthly, boycott of Chinese-made goods, which India has adopted as a strategy in the current dispute, is also not a great strategy, as it would be counterproductive for trade, and it acts against the theory of comparative advantage. So rather, India should either go for a military strategy straight away, or employ other diplomatic means. So I conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you for this, Bhavna. And we'll discuss it later. I have some disagreements with you, but nonetheless. Now, Tamanna, who we had lost earlier because of problems, I'd ask her to come in. We did hear the first part of her arguments, but Tamanna, if you can restart and do it in about 8 minutes, because you had taken about 3 to 4 minutes earlier. Thank you.
Sure, ma'am. Yeah. So my basic contention is that, you know, the concept of war should somehow disappear from. It's difficult for some countries, but you know, it comes rather easy for Indians because of certain cultural values which we uphold. So I guess I wanted to point out that even Chinese, I wanted to bring Chinese on the same page as Indians. And Chinese, for example, you know, they have philosophers in the past who have spoken about these concepts. and they have said that, you know, we need to keep war as just as the last value, last resort. So this has been the concept which has been built in India since the Mahabharata war, and it has over the period of time been imbibed by Indians in a certain way. So we have been from 47 onwards, we have focused on diplomacy and peace values, and we have been very active in UN forums. So I guess somewhere we need to understand that India and China have to reconcile on peace issues, and I guess there is no other uh, point of disagreement between the two countries, rather than, for example, Sun Tzu would say it's war is the last resort, and you know, foolish resorts to war by any country should be stopped, and the whole concept of diplomacy should come into picture. Keeping peace and avoiding war has been Sun Tzu's basic value, and that should also be something which, you know, because ideologically, if suppose certain countries are prone to war, they should understand that their cultural values are also similar to the different countries, and they might just have they might just come and reconcile on these issues and have points which are agreeable to each other. So we should reconcile on these aspects and come together and build a multilateral, multipolar world, rather than either China or US governing anybody. So Nepalese would find it quite interesting, and, you know, we should not lose a friend like Nepal anyway. And I guess they should also see that, you know, is it ideology which is more important, or is it culture which is more important? And I guess somewhere this is the whole thing. So I'll just conclude, because I couldn't say much. Ma'am has said that 8 minutes is enough. So thank you.
Thank you, Tamanna. I think you made your point very effectively, that there are philosophies of both sides. There's philosophies of war and there are philosophies of peace and diplomacy. I think that is a very clear point. So thank you for that. And now we have Sitara Noor, who is a senior researcher in the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Sitara, yes, I can see you on the screen. Yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the kind, brief introduction. And I want to thank NICE for arranging this a very dynamic group of women, putting them together. And I'm pleased to listen to some of the views that have already been shared. So I'm talking about, briefly talk about the India-China standoff that currently is ongoing. The standoff, as we have observed over the past 2 months, is at the line of actual control in Eastern Ladakh and Sikkim, is one of the most serious military development between the two Asian neighbors. As very eloquently explained by previous speaker, Ms. Bhavna, so I will straight jump into the analytical part, not going into the detail of how the situation looks like now. But by all means, this is a watershed moment, not only in India-China relationship, but also in terms of shifting regional alignments. The issue is still ongoing and turning out to be the longest crisis between the two nuclear neighbors, surpassing the Doklam crisis of 2017 in terms of length as well as the intensity. So what instigated the crises? There are multiple reasons and multiple views coming from different spectrum of opinions. But in my view, if we look at what were the immediate causes, there were primarily two reasons, as also observed by various analysts as well, that India's infrastructural development in close proximity to Chinese claims of LAC, and also another immediate point of crisis instigation was making Ladakh a union territory, announced as in August 5th last year. Even at the beginning of the crisis, it was felt that notwithstanding a mutual willingness to de-escalate, it would be quite challenging to determine the original provocateur in this crisis. There are claims and counterclaims from both Indian and Chinese officials and the analysts as well, that who should hold the onus of responsibility to act first And for that, it would be important to determine who is the original provocateur, who did first step, which actually led to the crises. After the June 15 fight, leading to casualties on both sides, as Bhavna had explained already, both countries are continuing to shift the onus of responsibility on one another on the initiation of that serious military exchanges. But the current relative peace, which many analysts have termed as an ugly stability, is as fragile as it looks. At the beginning of the crisis, it was analyzed that a potential end of hostilities may lead to following 4 scenarios. And the first would be a stalemate with a looming risk of inadvertent future escalation. Number 2 could be an acceptance of fate accompanied with no further risk of escalation. And third being enforcing a status quo ante. And the fourth, escalation horizontally to de-escalate vertically. This is one of the risk elements that Pakistan specifically is concerned about. That is India is trying to open up a new front. That Indian military leadership had also been talking about, that a true front war scenario, opening a new front to get a better bargaining position and finding some face saving as well. Although it is still early to draw a definitive conclusion as to which direction the crisis is going or might be concluded eventually, but it is safe to say that risks of more escalation has considerably minimized. Furthermore, regardless of the outcome, the crisis has brought to surface important dynamics that will help us assess the future trajectory of events. First of all, it has exposed India's inability to engage China militarily. The deterrence not only on the nuclear side, but also on the conventional deterrence has played it.
तुमने पहला पॉइंट बोल लिया था, तुमने 8 मिनट लो, 10 मिनट
So it has, first of all, it has exposed India's inability to engage China militarily, thereby further eroding India's purported position as the net security provider in the region. It will ensue claims from the Indian nonetheless for its domestic as well as international audience to declare any form of de-escalation as a sign of victory. We have seen this situation or spin taking shape already during the visit of Prime Minister Modi and recent visit of Defense Minister Rajnath to the front line, and stating that India would not give an inch of its territory, whereas on the factual side, still a number of relatively great number of Indian territory is still under the Chinese control. What was the Indian perception of the line of actual control? So this further highlights the problem of absence of an agreed status quo. Currently, India and China have a different perception of the status quo, but India's recent statement and position seems to be agreeing to Chinese perception of the status quo, where China is holding lands previously, part of Indian perception of line of actual control at various locations. Second point that needs to be a situation that needs to be watched and keep in mind is that even if the current hostilities were managed successfully, recurrent tensions would be a new normal in the region, as the grievances of the parties are likely to outlive any temporary solution. The US-China competition will also intensify in the future and will continue to add more heat to India-China confrontational situation. The third point that I want to make is that the theater of war could be different. India has already gone into economic theater by banning 59 Chinese company and Huawei 5G network in the country. China too may not indulge in a traditional battleground fight, but in rather more in the virtual space. That is cyber and space domain. Communication information denial may further decapacitate, expose India's strength vis-a-vis China. Thirdly, it will put a strain on India to choose one of the two different roles it is playing simultaneously. That is exercising hedging, where India is having not only cooperating with Russia at one hand or the US on the other hand, but also having some cooperative understanding with China previously as well. Or its claim to have strategic autonomy, placing it more centrally. This actually probably, in my opinion, would lead India to place it more centrally in India-China future confrontation. Sorry, US-China future confrontation. India being on the aligning more closely with the US in that situation. Fourthly, Pakistan will have to remain vigilant, as we have seen various statements coming from various Indian political as well as the military leadership. And Pakistan, in response, talking about where Indian and policymakers have been talking about a two-front war scenario. So in that view, Pakistan will have to beef up its security levels and alert level at the line of control, as well as the international border, as India may escalate or try to escalate at the line of control on Kashmir border as well as on the international border. Pakistan will have to show resolve to carry out its stated policy of quid pro quo plus if it becomes a target of India's misplaced anger. Lastly, in view of growing American presence in the region and blurring the line between competition and confrontation, China will probably have to reassess its cooperative security policy as a tool to advance its interest in the region. China probably would emerge as a more assertive, as well as having more, using more military angle to this cooperative model that it is presenting to the rest of the world. Thank you. I conclude here.
Thank you, Sitara, for this analysis, and I hope it comes into the discussion later. I would now ask Yashaswini Patel. Are you here? Yes, you are. I can see you. Yeah. If you can take your 10 minutes. Thank you. Yeah.
May I request you to share the screen now, the slides? Ma'am?
Yashaswini's slides have to be shared by the organizers, I guess. Okay.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity, Nice. And the topic of my paper is the assessment of Siachen Glacier conflict. And we'll try to briefly discuss the challenges which is associated with the de-escalation of the Siachen Glacier. The next slide. We will talk about what are the objectives and what is important to discuss about the Siachen Glacier. First, we'll understand what is the strategic necessity of Siachen Glacier at such an height. Why is the army being placed between the two important nations? And we'll try to understand what are the problems faced by the Indian soldiers, both in terms of the logistics as well as the financial terms. And the next point we would discuss is about the we'll try to examine what are the reasons why the de-escalation has failed. Next slide. If you look at this map, we'll get to know the location of the Siachen Glacier. The dotted black line is the location of it. It is located near the East Karakoram ranges, and it is actually the second largest glacier in the world, only after the Lombard Fissure, which is located in Antarctica. The elevation of this is 17,750, which is above the sea level. And the total area of that dotted line is 76 square kilometer. The next slide. If we have to talk about the background of the conflict and how the conflict has actually started, both the Karachi Agreement of 1978 and the Shimla Agreement of 1972, both of them do not mention who will control the line beyond NJ 9842 till the end. There is no clear agreement about who is going to control the entire region. And India actually realized that the mountaineers from Europe and America were seeking permission from the Pakistani officials to go on an expedition. And this was actually reported by the Kanal Kumar's expedition. After realizing that many of them are seeking permission, the Indian government sent Polar Bear 1 and the Polar Bear 2 expedition in 1983. And within no time, there was this intelligence agency reporting that Pakistan has ordered the equipments which will be used in the mountaineers. A huge amount has been ordered. India was very skeptical about Pakistan occupying the Siachen. So India conducted the Operation Meghdut and successfully heli-dropped the team which occupied Bilafon, Siala and Indrakul. These were the three main points which was captured by the team. And to counter this, Operation Ababil was launched by Pakistan, but it was largely unsuccessful. The next slide. We will talk about what are the strategic importance of Siachen. If you look at that image, it clearly shows that the Nubra rivers joins the Shok River and it further joins the Indus River, and that actually flows from the Siachen Glacier. So we actually know the importance of Indus River. And it is a tri-junction between India, Pakistan and China, because China directly, because there's this illegally ceded region, Shaksam Valley, which has been ceded by Pakistan to China. And Siachen also plays an important role in safeguarding Kargil and Leh base, as well as to safeguard the national highway which will pass through Srinagar, Leh, which will further connect Aksai Chin. Aksai Chin is currently administered by China after the 1962 war, and Kunjar Pass and the Karakoram Highway. These are the few important places which can be administered and like it can be overseen by having a better position on Siachen Glacier, as well as Siachen gives an advantage to overlook on the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which is also administered by Pakistan. And Siachen, currently India holds a position at different heights, that is 22,000 feet, 20,000, 18,000 and the 16,000. That is Indra Kol, Palwan Valley and Billa Top and Kumar height. All of them are occupied by India. The next slide. The challenges, if we talk about the challenges related to Siachen, it clearly says that less than 3% of the soldiers have died because of the enemy's activities, and the rest, the 97% of the soldiers have died only due to the temperature, which has caused a huge number of deaths, both in the side of India as well as the Pakistani side. And logistics are everyday heli dropped, but sometimes due to the weather conditions, there's a huge problem, and sometimes this whatever the weapons, food, artillery, whatever is heli dropped, they're actually lost. The next slide. So if we talk about the dialogue over Siachen, from 1985, there are many dialogues held, and they have largely failed. First thing is that India is asking for a status quo and asking Pakistan to move behind and seize the cartographic aggression, where Pakistan has largely denied it. And till date, there are 13 rounds of peace talks held, but there has been not much of progress, although many, both in terms of India and Pakistan, both the teams argue that that two bald men are fighting over Coombe, but to a large extent, there is too much of strategic necessity to both the nations. And after this dialogue has happened, people have spoken about, transboundary peace park, but it has largely been failed over these things. And to maintain strategic importance, India has recently opened a tourism place over the Siachen, and as well as it has been conducting Siachen Swachh Bharat, as well as many other things over this. Although we are not able to de-escalate it, it has largely failed till now. The next slide. I've briefly mentioned this as a peace park, and the main reason why we are proposing for a peace park is that many people argue that it doesn't bring glory for a nation whose soldiers die of hypothermia, cerebral frostbite, and snow blindness. So the next slide. This picture actually gives the clear picture about what is happening in Siachen. That is when the soldiers were they usually lose their lives due to the weather conditions and all of it. The next slide. If you have to conclude this, till date, there is no clear demarcation about the actual ground position on the Siachen. That is one of the main reasons for a conflict. And Siachen has largely been a no man's land for a longer time. till 1984, of course, still India has conducted Meghdut and strengthened its position. And Siachen has become an emotional issue for Indian Army to maintain strategic position, although it has been widely criticized for death of soldiers due to the weather conditions. And talks over the de-escalation has only failed because of the trust there. And thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Yashaswini. And now is the last panelist, but we have plenty of time, hopefully, for discussion. And there are a lot of questions which are coming to my mind also. So we have now Dr. Sriparna Pathak. She's the Assistant Academic Dean, School of International Affairs in the O.P. Jindal Global University. Welcome, Sriparna, and you have your 8 to 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, ma'am.
One more thing I'd request others to mute, because we can sometimes hear your chat. So please, others do mute and only put it on when you need to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, I am muted by the host.
We can hear you now, Sriparna. You're
Okay,
unmuted. Yeah.
Okay. I welcome you all to my presentation on diplomatic doublespeak and Chinese foreign policy. A fact that reverberates throughout the 21st century international order is that China has emerged as a very important player, and its astounding economic growth rates along with its astute diplomacy have enabled this emergence. What also remains a fact is that Chinese foreign policy making is a black box to most of the outsiders, with opacity as a dominant trait of it. Myriad forms of diplomacy have been used by China for addressing various issues. The latest one is that of wolf warrior diplomacy, which sees a much more fighting spirit in China's diplomats. This form of diplomacy has emerged from 2019 onwards. But there have been multiple other types of diplomacy practiced by China. And there's this clever usage of words and phrases, which has played a much longer and much more permanent role in Chinese foreign policy to achieve Chinese national interests. In this context, it becomes pertinent to mention Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky's pioneering work in the book called Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of Mass Media. Herman and Chomsky write about how Orwellian doublespeak is an important facet of the manipulation of the English language in American media through a process called dichotomization, which basically implies the usage of deeply embedded double standards in the reporting of news. While Herman and Chomsky's work relates to American media, similar tactics have also been used by the Chinese media, which is, well, basically largely an outgrowth of the state. A quick look at news reportage and tweets by China's state-controlled mouthpiece, Global Times, reveals the usage of the exact same strategies of doublespeak, which have been talked about by Herman and Chomsky. An example of this is the standoff between the Indian and the Chinese army at Doklam, when the armies of the two sides mutually withdrew in August 2017. And Global Times reported how the de-escalation was a win-win for Asia. However, while the Global Times and other state-controlled media outlets were painting a win-win amicable situation, not just for India and China, but for the entire Asia, Chinese army had slowly restarted building its infrastructure at the contested site, as has been revealed by satellite imagery. Now, an interesting facet about the usage of doublespeak is that it is also practiced by the Chinese army as well as by the Chinese state. For example, China's military strategy, in its white paper, which was released in 2015, stated that China does not seek an overseas constellation of bases. But the fact remains that China is constructing islands in disputed territory in the South China Sea. The white paper of 2015 also added that peace, development, and cooperation and mutual benefit have become an irresistible tide of the times. It stated how China's external environment in 2015 was generally favorable, quote unquote. Yet, the entire white paper was about how China intends to cope with challenges to expand its interests, because of which a larger and more diverse military is needed. In short, the paper, full of doublespeak, whitewash new and assertive content through self-contradiction, usage of ambiguous phrases, and seemingly benign statements, while describing a brave new People's Liberation Army at the same time. On the state's usage of doublespeak, the example of the imposition of the national security law on Hong Kong deserves a special mention. To begin with, the national security law spells the end of the promise made by the People's Republic of China, the PRC, that Hong Kong could maintain its own way of life. Deng Xiaoping had formulated the constitutional principle of one country, two systems in the 1980s when he was negotiating the return of Hong Kong to the PRC with the United Kingdom. Deng had stated that there would be only one China, but Hong Kong could retain its own administrative and economic systems, while the rest of mainland China follows socialism with Chinese characteristics. But now, as seen in the national security law, provisions criminalize secession as any act that might be interpreted as breaking away from the country. There's a criminalization of any activity that might be seen as subversive or undermining the power or authority of the central government. And it brings activities which use violence or intimidation of people under the ambit of terrorism. It also criminalizes activities by foreign forces that interfere in Hong Kong. Now, residents of Hong Kong are worried that China will step up its own institutions in the city for the purposes of maintenance of law. Thus, this national security law means the end of the way of life, which was followed in Hong Kong, which included rights such as freedom of expression and protest, which, according to Deng Xiaoping, was to exist till 2047 under this arrangement known as one country, two systems. In this context, it's very important to understand two large-scale incidents which took place in Hong Kong in 2014 and 2019. In 2014, there was a series of sit-in protests, often called the Umbrella Revolution or the Occupy movement, which occurred in Hong Kong from September 14 to December 15. And they began because the PRC issued a decision regarding proposed reforms to Hong Kong's electoral system. The National People's Congress Standing Committee, NPCSC, of the PRC decided that there would be a 1,200-member nominating committee based in the current format, followed by the present election commission, which will select only 2 or 3 candidates before presenting them for a territory-wide ballot by ordinary voters. Each candidate must have more than half of the support of the members of the election committee. The election committee is Hong Kong's electoral college, and the function is to select the chief executive. So because of this proposal, the fear set in Hong Kong that the limits set by Beijing for the selection of the city's leader, its chief executive, will lead to biased choices. The fear was very high because in March 2013, Xiao Xiaoyuan, the chairman of the law committee under the NPCSC, he stated that the chief executive candidates must be persons who love the country and Hong Kong and who do not insist on confronting the central government. So it was believed that this was to screen out candidates from the pro-democracy groups in Hong Kong. In the protests which followed, government officials in Hong Kong as well as in Beijing denounced the occupation or the peaceful sit-ins as illegal and violations of the rule of law. Chinese state media and officials repeatedly claimed that the West had an instigating role. The second incident is from 2019, and these protests which emerged in 2019 are still ongoing. These emerged because of the enactment of the Fugitive Offenders Amendment Bill, which would allow the extradition of wanted suspects to territories including the PRC and Taiwan, with which Hong Kong does not have extradition treaties when the proposal was introduced. So this led to the concern that the bill will subject Hong Kong residents and visitors to the jurisdiction and legal system of the PRC, thereby undermining Hong Kong's autonomy and civil liberties. It will infringe on privacy and freedom of speech laws. Now, all of this was a clear departure from the promises that Deng Xiaoping had made during Hong Kong's handover, a clear case of diplomatic doublespeak. Now, similar forms of doublespeak are also seen from the state in its pronouncements at the level of regional and international organizations. An example of this is the BRICS 2019 declaration. The BRICS grouping, even though consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, centers around China, which is the economic and diplomatic linchpin, the heavyweight in the grouping. While the US-China trade spat was raging, the BRICS 2019 declaration, it listed out the importance of free trade and multilateralism. Over the years, the tone in the BRICS declarations have been favoring the Chinese agenda. But the fact remains that out of all the countries, not just in the BRICS grouping, but in the world, China stands to gain the most through free trade because its economic growth model is based on an export-oriented growth model. This had taken a hit owing to the trade spat with the US. Ironically, free trade is something that China does not really permit when it comes to imports into China, as has been revealed by the IMF's annual report card on the Chinese economy, which criticizes the pervasive role played by the state in the economy and the restrictive investment and trade practices of the country. Diplomatic doublespeak has been an integral component of Chinese foreign policy over the years. And this example is from 1959 and is in the context of India. Chairman Mao Zedong, in 1959, May 15, 1959, he added a few words to a letter from the Chinese Foreign Ministry to India's Foreign Ministry, which stated that China's main attention and principle of struggle is focused on the East, the West Pacific region, and on ferocious American imperialism, not on India or on the Southeast or on South Asian countries at all. Mao Zedong said that China will not be so stupid as to make enemies with the US in the East and make enemies with India in the West. He also said that pacification of rebellion and implementing a democratic reform in Tibet would pose no threat to India whatsoever. So this led India to believe that a military confrontation was not likely with China, even though the two sides had started exchanging notes, memos, and letters on the border since 1954. But fact remains that 1962 did happen. Another example of the Chinese of diplomatic doublespeak is that from Chinese spokesperson Hua Chunying, when she said that countries should help each other in this COVID-19 pandemic. When Netherlands, however, to show its gratitude to Taiwan, revised its own embassy's name to Netherlands Office Taipei and flew in tulips and stroopwafels to Taiwan, China cut off its supply of medical equipment and face masks to the Netherlands, clearly in opposition, in juxtaposition to Hua Chunying's statement that countries should help each other in this COVID-19 pandemic. So, in order to have a better understanding of Chinese foreign policy, what becomes pertinent is the need to understand the doublespeak in the Chinese states, the Chinese medias, and Chinese military statements. A careful study of conditions surrounding the statements, the actual conditions prevailing on the ground is needed so as to gain a deeper insight of what might actually be in store for the recipient of Chinese doublespeak. I'll come to the end of my presentation, and thank you so much for your patience.
So thank you, Sriparna, and I think that completes all our panelists, and it gives us a good 40 minutes or so for discussion. I think we should restrict the discussion to about 35 minutes. And after that, I'll give each of you 2 minutes to again answer and come to a conclusion. But before I start all of you on asking your questions or discussing any points, I think I would take my position as moderator and make some observations. I'm not going to make observations on each speaker, but from what I could see is that there were 3 sets of paradigms and the three sets of the types of presentations made. One, which was the dominant, and it reflects a dominant realist discourse, was about seeing China as a predator, seeing it in this, kind of militarist terms, and making an argument. For example, some of the speakers said that China needs to be contained. They advocated in the India-China relationship, India should engage in containment. But at the same time, there were contradictions when they said that India and China should rather, India should have a war rather than stop trade. Now, the contradiction in that is that if you have a war, trade will also stop. So you need to look at your papers in that light, that if you're advocating that there should be a war, it would obviously also mean that trade would stop. So my point on this set of papers is that, as a teacher, and you don't have to take my position is always different, and you have a choice of taking your own position, is that when you advocate these kind of points, you should also perhaps consider the impact of your positions. It's not about just the philosophy of war or advocating containment, but what impact will it have on the two countries, on the region, on the local, on the people, and what would be the outcomes? So that could broaden your paradigm overall. Of course, all of you had very clear kind of a historical analysis, but you can use history either as a kind of a tunnel, or you can use history as a background. So that's also up to you. Now, the second paradigm, which was shorter, and I think briefer of fewer people, was which came actually from Tamanna and some others, was that there are two philosophies in Chinese and in Indian historiography in its tradition, in which there is a philosophy of war and there is a philosophy which focuses on diplomacy and peace. And there was an advocacy from some of the speakers that the focus should be an attempt to engage and to have greater diplomacies. And there was also, therefore, in that paradigm, a belief, therefore, that the people of the two countries, the region, and the international system should also be considered. The third set of speakers came into analyzing the Chinese domestic positions very clearly. And that was quite interesting for me also. And I think the last speaker, Sriparna, came into that, analyzing the doublespeak in China. And I was glad she used Noam Chomsky to show that that was there in the US also. But I would extend the argument to say that that is there in most countries, especially those, if you look at most foreign policies, there would be this doublespeak, there would be this kind of nationalism, a kind of a militarism, and because each power would look at their own pretty sometimes narrow interest and not really look at internationalism. This has lessened because of globalization, where countries are being forced to look at their own global impacts. It's not so easy now to close borders, and we can see that from the India-China standoff. So lastly, I'd say that one aspect which I found missing, but which would probably be there in other panels, is the economic aspects, which are very, very important now in any bilateral relations given given globalization. And the fact, even though countries are saying, you know, look inward, Atmanirbhar, etc., they cannot really block off what has been 2 decades of globalization. And people had argued that, some of the panelists very brilliantly had argued that, China has had export-led growth, and now they're looking differently. They had violated WTO rules. But I would also argue that China's path of development has been quite distinct from that of the West, with which they are now competing. And that is, while the US and Europe were doing financialization, China's growth trajectory has been of industrialization, and that continues. And even in their latest statement on economic policy, they're arguing that they're not going to go in for financialization because that will lead to deeper crisis, but that they would look for further industrialization and their domestic markets. So these are some of the things I'd like you to consider. And now I would throw the floor open. I think you can indicate who would like to speak, and the rest can mute and unmute accordingly. Sometimes there is a wave your hand in the Zoom, but I can't see it. But you can unmute or raise your hand, and then maybe whoever is the organizer at the back can unmute and continue. Yeah. So I can see one raised hand, and if you all share the entire screen, you can also. So yes, go ahead.
Ma'am, we can't hear you. You are on mute.
Yeah, no, I'm just asking those of you who would like to speak to unmute and start speaking. Yeah, one by one. So who's the first person who'd like to raise a question or answer anything?
Ma'am, I would want to ask a question to Pooja.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Pooja. I found your presentation very interesting, especially I also, because work on Xinjiang sometimes. From what I could perceive, you had taken a very a view that was that made us believe that this was a threat that the Chinese government perceived from Xinjiang. So how about the other way around? What do the people in Xinjiang perceive the threat as? Could you throw some light on that?
Sure, ma'am.
Okay, I think we'll take a couple of questions together. Any other questions to Pooja? Anybody else has any questions to Pooja? Okay, none. So Pooja, you can answer.
Yes, ma'am. So these are the presentation was mainly what China perceives threat from Xinjiang. So what Xinjiang perceives threat from the Chinese is entirely different. For example, China is using its move for religious suppression, what is happening, and then in the huge settlement of Han Chinese in the Xinjiang province. So these are the moves what China is using in Xinjiang. And then Xinjiang is perceiving these. These are the threats what Xinjiang is perceiving from the Chinese government. So this is what I wanted to tell you.
Okay, so I think that's apt. The fact is, I think Pooja did also, she did say in her paper about Sinicization, which basically means destroying the ethnic identity of the people in Xinjiang. So anybody else now? Next person for question. Any other comments from anyone? Tamanna, do you want to comment? Yes, again, you can. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, for Ms. Sitara, you talked about how another front opening in terms of another front which could be opened against Pakistan. How do you perceive the people-to-people relationship between the Indians and Pakistanis when it comes to disputed issues?
Thank you for your question, Bhavna. When I talk about the risk of opening another front, I'm referring to many of the statements coming from the Indian political leadership, where they have talked about India's preparation to be able to fight a two-front war with China as well as with Pakistan. And also coupled with some major threats coming from the top leadership with regards to taking control of the Gilgit-Baltistan that forms the part of Pakistan's territory and under Pakistan's control. So Pakistan takes those threats very seriously, and especially after keeping in view India's attack on mainland Pakistan in the aftermath of Balakot, the Balakot strikes that took place on the Pakistan's territory. And Pakistan saw that an attempt from Indian side to set a new normal, which Pakistan's response, which Pakistan did on the second day, was actually to ensure that deterrence prevails, and Pakistan would not, to show Pakistan's resolve that no such action would be tolerated on the Pakistan side. But that had not minimized the risk of any future confrontation, mainly because the situation in the Indian occupied Kashmir remains very precarious, which Pakistan flags at various international forums. And Pakistan also highlights the risk, with the perceived risk from the Pakistani side at the international forum, that India might try to create a false flag operation inside Indian territory and use it as a justification to attack on Pakistan, which Pakistan says was the case in the 2019 attack on the Balakot as well. So these are the risks which actually are highlighted from Pakistani sides time and again. And Pakistan sees them as a real threat. And that's why Pakistan had been advocating quite vehemently that if at all there is some adventure from the Indian side, or provocation from Indian side, Pakistan would respond in a quid pro quo plus manner, in which it would not be only the responding to the threat, but adding some premium to Indian action so that India deters from taking action against Pakistan. Having said that, coming on to the second part of your question with regards to looking at the people-to-people contact, I think Indian and Pakistani population are very charged, emotionally charged, I would say. I mean, I haven't come across any Indian who is not courteous, who is not good, and who is not looking forward to having a good relation with the Pakistani. And I think many of my Indian colleagues that I have met share the same opinion. So I think the situation gets charged politically, and particularly there have been, I mean, Pakistan, I'm talking about the perception in Pakistan. You may disagree and you may say that the situation is slightly different in Indian side. But I think public opinion has gone against, in India, more on against Pakistan more since the BJP government has come, mainly because they are using entire Pakistan sentiments to win the election, and they are adding more fuel to that fire, which I think is not across the spectrum, that does not exist across the spectrum. As I said, there are many Indians who want to positively engage with Pakistan, and same is the case in Pakistan. But I think people-to-people contact is one thing which can actually mitigate the problematic situation, which can actually add, and we have actually run a number of confidence building measures on the basis of these people-to-people engagements in the past, and they have worked very well, and they have increased the confidence among the both states. And I think from Pakistani side, opening up of the Kartarpur corridor for the Sikh pilgrimage was a one good step in that direction to not only lessen the sentiments of hostility, but also let people come on that side. And that was, I think, a big step amidst all the tension that was already existing on the Indian side, or the provocations coming from the Indian side. So yeah, I mean, I am a strong believer in people-to-people engagement, which has had good impact in the past. And I think the both governments should work quite significantly. And if we talk about official, since we are talking about people-to-people, I may throw some light on the confidence building measure process. The process remains stalled since 2012. The last secretary level talk that took place between India and Pakistan were by the end of 2012. And at that forum, Pakistan had put on the table a whole list of confidence building measures that included not only people-to-people contact, but some military and nuclear confidence building measures. And some of those confidence building measures were in the nuclear domain, and that remains my primary area of interest. So I was very keenly looking at a few of the safety and security, nuclear safety and security related CBMs, which could have benefited both the states. But there was no reciprocity from the Indian side. And India did not actually reciprocated Pakistan's position on that. And since then, as by many Pakistani political as well as the military leadership has been highlighted, that there is a kind of a sense of CBM fatigue on Pakistani side because of India's non-action and India's non-reciprocity. And Pakistan too has become kind of, that fatigue kind of element has drawn on Pakistani side, which is not a good sign, because engagement channels must remain open, notwithstanding the political situation or the military situation, because that's where I think countries can hope, can find some hope for the better future and better relationship. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sitara. And I think I'd add to this, in the 90s and early 2000s, there were so many different types of track 1, track 2, track 3, people-to-people engagements. But I think those were positive, as you very correctly put it. But I think you do need the states to allow this, visas for people-to-people contact, some kind of liberal opening up. And this gets closed if you have a hostile media which sees anyone who tries to engage in people-to-people conversation as anti-national, because you only have one view that everyone is the same in these two countries. I mean, there is a hyper-nationalist Pakistani media which talks about this one India which is aggressive, and there is Indian hyper-nationalist, like almost a warring media they say kind of in their panel discussion, put your hands up if you want a war with China, with either China or Pakistan. So that's unfortunate. And that has actually, you know, been a step back in the relations. And I think the states do need to encourage people-to-people relations. And if they want to have successful state-to-state relations or even status quo, I think they will also have to at some point realize that people-to-people relations are important. Trade is important. Even the cross-border trade, which was there between India and Pakistan, has been almost stopped. So this kind of blockage is, I feel, unfortunate. And the same is not true for China, where it's still possible to have some kind of people-to-people engagement in China between academics, etc., trade, etc. And you can see that the India-China relations are actually maybe not warm, but at least they're not at that kind of Cold War stage. So now again, I ask those who would like to add to the discussion. Please do unmute and ask your question.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Sure, Sriparna, please go ahead.
Who's
your question to?
To Aparajita. So Aparajita, you spoke very well about China's penetration and India's position in South Asia. You mentioned the SAARC, and you talked about how China is seeking to enter into SAARC. And you also mentioned that, SAARC is very political, which is why economically we haven't been able to take off. So why do you think China then wants to enter SAARC? Like, what are its calculations? Economically, we haven't really taken off as well as, say, the ASEAN has done, or maybe the EU has done. Then why does China want to be a part of the SAARC?
See, we can see that among South Asian countries, the trade, as you already mentioned, that the trade is less than 5% of the total trade of the world. So it shows that the SAARC, which was formed for economic integration, it is not doing well because of the political problems, mainly between India and Pakistan, and other political issues between other countries, among other countries. So if China acquires its membership, China is trying to maintain a good relation with all the South Asian countries in terms of military, in terms of economy. So in my point of view, I believe that if China acquires the membership of SAARC, which I don't think it will be able to, as far as India is there, and then it can have a platform where it can keep all other South Asian countries in its favor by talking, by deliberating at one platform. So it will provide China with a strong platform where it can we can have issues with all other South Asian countries. And as we know that it plays so tactfully that South Asian countries, they are also allowing China to enter into their places and building development process in military and economic. So this is what I believe.
Thank you.
So Aparajita, suppose I played devil's advocate and said that China doesn't really need SAARC as a platform. They have other platforms. They're part, India and China are both part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're part of the BRICS. China, in any case, is engaging more and more deeply with all of South Asia. But if India, for example, you're advocating that India should not allow China into SAARC. That's the Indian position because they don't see China as a South Asian nation. But geographies can shift. Geography is also a perception. At the same time then, for example, there can be an exchange. For example, China can support India in the Security Council if India supports China into SAARC. So there are different views on that. So with that, I again ask others who would like to intervene at this point. And also you can disagree with the moderator. If you have anything which you don't agree with me, you can also go ahead with that, please. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, somewhere we need to have more perception of more people who are advocating peace and, cultural talks at South Asian level. And, we need to consider China, for example, And we need to understand, as ma'am also is saying, that geographically and culturally, if we look at the Confucianist culture, and if we look at Hindu culture, there would be many areas where we would be colliding with each other. So our cultural issues are similar in the South Asian region. Pakistan, for example, would be one of those cases. Sri Lanka, so Bhutan, and we have engaged with many of these countries in a friendly manner. And so I guess somewhere we need to be more dovish. So, I just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
Okay, but Tamanna, I have a point for you. Is there just one Hindu culture, as you call it? I mean, it's so plural within that also.
It is
and
plural.
there is an Indian, there is a culture which developed, as you said, that there are similarities between some aspects of India and Pakistani culture. If there is one such category as Pakistani culture, so there's so many differences there also. So
yeah,
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, we do have differences. It doesn't matter, but we are multicultural, for example, and most countries are. They might acknowledge it or they might not acknowledge it. But India is acknowledging the fact that we are multicultural. That's another issue, obviously, because Hindus are obviously very diverse in their pattern of practicing. Be it, if we compare West Bengal from Kerala, or Hindus in Kashmir or anywhere, for example. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else would like to come in here? Anyone of the participants or even the organizers, if they would like to speak, because we do have a few minutes more. So it looks to me like we're coming towards the conclusion of a very useful session. I would, of course, like to thank and congratulate all the speakers who did very deep research. And their speeches were an outcome of their thinking, of their research, and their great and wonderful concerted effort. My position always is that I think even though I'm 67, I'm a lifelong learner, and I learned a lot from all of you. I also keep a watch on I read 3 or 4 newspapers. I even read some of the Chinese papers, the Russian papers, of course, New York Times and the Indian papers. So also keep in touch, and I hope all of you will too, and look at the diverse aspects of international relations and of bilateral relations, because there's nothing anymore in a vacuum. There is bilateralism, but within that bilateralism, there are triangles, there are straight lines, but there are also concentric circles. So do look at it that way. And thank you to you and to the organizers, to NICE, to the Nepal Institute, which is doing a great job. I've been listening into several of their Zoom seminars. So thank you very much. Back to the organizers now.